Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Advati Naik, and I'm a postdoctoral researcher at the Qatar Biomedical Research Institute, or QBRI. And it is with great pleasure that I welcome you all to the third webinar in our series of QBRI talks for early career researchers. For those attending for the first time, this webinar series provides a platform to inspire young researchers to actively participate in personal and professional development. And related to this, we have previously spoken about building a career development plan as well as grant writing. If you missed these previous webinars, you can watch a recording on the HVKU YouTube channel. A couple of housekeeping rules before we begin. So the talk today will be broken down into two 45-minute sessions. After the first half of the talk, we will pause for a couple of minutes for some questions, followed by the rest of the talk and a second Q&A session. The microphone of all attendees have been muted, but we encourage you all to post questions during the course of the talk in the Q&A tab and not the chat tab. Please also direct these questions to all the panelists to make sure that your questions are visible to us. The webinar will be recorded and a link to it will be shared within the next couple of days. The speaker has also sent out a handout for notes which you would have received by email to download. But if you haven't received this, we will share a link to the download file now in the chat tab, if you would prefer to download it. Moving on, our topic for today is presenting your research effectively. So as researchers, we are called upon to make numerous types of presentations, and this could be at institutional seminars, at a thesis defense, at conferences, poster presentations, and job interviews. And so strong communication skills are definitely key in science. Whether it is to a professional or a lay audience, being able to communicate science clearly and eloquently is definitely a skill that is developed with practice. Our webinar today will emphasize on key aspects of preparing and delivering an effective presentation on your research. So with this, I would like to welcome our speaker for today, Dr. Michael Zygmunt. Dr. Zygmunt received his PhD in 1967 at the University of Pittsburgh in biopsychology, followed by postdoctoral work at MIT before assuming a faculty position at the University of Pittsburgh. His research has resulted in more than 250 publications and focused on the effects of stress, exercise, and isolation on brain health. His research has been funded by the NIH, the National Science Foundation, as well as the US Department of Defense. He remained at Pittsburgh until 2017, when he retired as Professor Emeritus in the Department of Neurology. Very early in his career, Dr. Zygmunt began to teach what he termed survival skills, the abilities he felt were needed to succeed as a professional. He has now taught workshops on such skills throughout the United States and in many countries around the world, particularly in Africa and in the Middle East. He has also received a number of awards for his educational work, including the Order of the Dragon from the Government of Senegal and a Lifetime Achievement Award from the Society of Neuroscience. He was also named a Fellow of the American Association for the Advancement of Science in 2010. Dr. Zygmunt, we are indeed honored to host you today and really appreciate your support and time to talk to us about your experience in developing effective presentation skills. The floor is yours now, and we'll begin to share your slides for you. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Adviti. It's a distinct pleasure to me to be able to speak to the people in Qatar. I hope that someday when the world returns towards normal, I will be able to come and visit. So what you see here is just the title of my talk. Note that at the bottom is my email address. It's my personal email address as opposed to my professional email address. It doesn't matter. They both go to the same place. And I would be very interested in hearing from any of you about really any aspect of professional development. I've lectured on just about all of them, and I'm here to help you, especially since I'm retired and also I haven't left the house for 6 months. I've got lots of time. So this is just some of the people that I would like to acknowledge. Dr. El Agnaf, I met when I was at the United Arab Emirates. Now that he's moved to Qatar, I guess he remembered me and recommended me as somebody who could give these kinds of lectures. Adviti has been my guide, and she is your guide, actually, for the next 2 hours. Beth Fisher is my colleague and friend, and most of the teaching that we've done, including the teaching at the UAE, she was part of. And you've already heard from Aditi the places that have provided us with funding, in addition to the University of Pittsburgh, which paid our salary and provided us with resources. Next. Okay, so here's the title of the talk that I'm going to give, and we are going to try to deal with the various issues that are demonstrated in that slide. This is a brief outline of what I'm going to cover, roughly in the order in which I will cover it. As I think Aditi mentioned, we're going to have at least 15 minutes between the two sessions, and then again at the end of the second session for your questions. I'm anxious to hear your questions because I will not have accomplished anything if, when we're finished, there are important issues that you do not understand. So please feel free to ask me any question, large or small. If it turns out that we run out of time, we can continue to communicate by email. Next. Okay, so this may seem like an obvious question, but I don't think it is. Why should you make presentations? Let me tell you that I graduated from college and then from graduate school, and then I did postdoctoral research. And the first important talk I ever gave in public was when I was looking for a job. I didn't like talking, and I avoided any opportunities. I did have to defend my thesis. That's the only talk I ever gave as a graduate student. I didn't have to do any kind of teaching when I was a postdoc. And so I saved this very important skill, the development of this very important skill, for when I was looking for a job. And I can tell you that the first few interviews I had were failures because I just didn't know how to get up in front of a group. I didn't know how to make slides. I didn't know how to talk or to answer questions. And really, when I realized as a young faculty member that some of the skills necessary to be successful were skills that no one ever taught me, they just took it for granted that you could either figure it out or you would fail, that I began to develop these kinds of workshops. We have a saying in the United States: you either sink or you swim. Well, that seems like an extremely harsh and inefficient way to make use of the talent that we spend so many years developing. And so I don't believe in sink or swim. I believe in including swimming lessons all the way along from the beginning until you're a full-fledged professional. Next slide. Okay, so when you get up in front of a group, what are you trying to do? Well, one of the things you're trying to do is to educate the audience. You're trying to educate the audience about the material that you have been doing research on. And I would actually argue that that's an ethical responsibility. After all, I don't fund my own research. I get my research money from public funds. And the reason that the money is used for my research is so that I can advance science. And I do that two ways. One is to publish papers, and maybe at some point in the future we can talk about writing papers. But the other is by giving talks, and we'll talk about why giving talks is a very useful precursor to writing your manuscripts. The other thing you're doing when you give a talk is you are teaching the audience about yourself. And that's, I think, very valuable in terms of developing your reputation. And as we will discuss later, when you're looking for a job and you're presenting yourself as a potential colleague. The second set of reasons to give talks are on this slide. When you are, no, can we go back? When you are getting ready to write your manuscript for publication, this is the time to see what additional information you would like to have. Once you publish your paper, it is permanent and it will be there forever. 50 years, 100 years from now, the paper will be still in libraries. Even if for some reason you decide to retract your paper, the paper will still be in libraries. So when you give a talk, hopefully in preparing the talk and in getting comments from the audience, you will get some feedback. Are there other experiments that I should have thought to do? Are there controls I missed? Are there other ways of interpreting my results? Is there something that somebody has published that I missed? And these are all things that I have obtained by giving talks. It's really pretty much too late to get this kind of information after you've published. Okay, so of course I'm speaking in English. It's the only language I know. I recognize the fact that for all of you, I expect, English is either the second language or maybe even the third language that you speak. So why am I, well, I'm speaking in English because that's the only language I have, but why would I encourage you to speak, to give your talks in English, and for that matter, to write your papers in English? Well, at the present time, English is the international language of science. That wasn't always true. In the late 19th century, English was, German was the international language. And in fact, there's a very famous neuroscientist, Ramon y Cajal, who was in Spain, and he noticed that no one was paying any attention to his work. And somebody pointed out to him that very few people in science know Spanish. So he learned German and he went to Germany and he gave his talks in Germany and he wrote his papers in German, and he became famous and eventually won the Nobel Prize. The other reason for speaking in English is that because it's an international language, although you may not, you would not need it in your home country, but many of you, I hope most of you, would like to expand your reach beyond your home country, beyond the Middle East. And so Arabic, while it is one of the most well-known and commonly spoken languages, it's not spoken by and large, for example, in Europe or in South America or in North America. So English is a very useful language to have in your back pocket if you are speaking to an audience that does not know Arabic. Okay, so if you're going to give a talk, what do you need to have if this is a science talk? First is you have to have made a contribution that's worth the time of the audience. And secondly, you need to adjust your talk, and we'll talk about several different kinds of audiences. You need to be able to adjust your talk to the audience. Next, you need reasonable language skills. You need the words, you need the grammar, but most important, you need the pronunciation. If you don't use quite the right word, or you don't use a perfectly grammatically correct sentence, that's okay if I can understand the words. I can make corrections if I understand the words. But if you don't pronounce the words in a way that I can understand them, then the best vocabulary and the best grammar will be of no use. So I'll probably mention later, one of the things you want to be sure to do is to rehearse your talk with a native speaker, if you can find such a person, and encourage them to focus on the quality of your pronunciation. You also need a good organization, and we'll spend a fair amount of time talking about organization. Next slide. And I'm a big fan of slides. Some people don't use slides when they talk. Some people have terrible slides. I'm sure that many of you have gone to talks where the speaker says, I know you can't read this slide, it's too small, it's too cluttered, but, and this is what I want to say, well, that's stupid. That's impolite. That means they're showing something to you that they know you can't make use of. So why exactly are they showing it to you? So we'll spend a fair amount of time talking about slides, and finally practice. As we say, practice, then practice, then practice. Next slide. Okay, so let's talk about making slides. Next slide. So these are the main points. I won't go through them in detail because you have them on your handout, but we're going to deal with each of them. And I would like to point out that the last word in the second line is misspelled. So that's one of the reasons that you always want to check your slides. I'm not going to talk about main pints. I'm going to talk about main points. Sorry. Next slide. Okay, so what's the purpose of slides? Next slide. There are two sets of purposes. The first is you can say things more efficiently with a slide. You can make things clearer with a slide. That's especially true if there's a language problem. I have made use of papers that are published in languages I don't know, but I've used the tables and figures, and the same thing with slides. I may not understand everything that the speaker is saying, but I can usually understand their slides. It makes it more interesting. It makes you appear to be a more professional scientist. And as you'll see, it significantly increases the likelihood that the audience will remember what you said. Next slide. Okay, so here are some data. If you simply speak your message and you ask people to tell you what you said 3 hours later, it's pretty good. They remember about 70%. If they simply read what you said or simply look at your slides, it's about 70%. It's about the same. If you combine words and slides, it's a little bit higher. It's not a big deal, but it's a little bit higher. But look at what happens if you do this test 3 days later. So most people will have forgotten 90% of what they heard. They will have forgotten 80% of what they saw or read. But if you combine verbal and visual ways of presenting the information, it goes way up to 70, almost 70%. So audience recall is dramatically increased by combining verbal and visual. And to this, I would add that it goes up even higher if people are taking notes. And so that's why I distributed handouts. They're not all the slides, they're just some of the slides. They're the main slides, and there's only 3 on a page, not because I want to waste paper, but because I want to leave you with plenty of room to take notes. So I don't know what the data would look like if we combined verbal, visual, and writing, but my guess is it would be getting close to 90%. I always, wherever I go to hear a talk, I always have a notebook with me. People say, why do you always take notes? Do you ever look at them? And the answer is, I don't always look at them. but just the act of taking notes increases the likelihood that I will remember. Next slide. Okay, so I said why. I see I have another spelling error. Sorry. That's supposed to say audience. So I've said why the audience profits from slides. How about you? Well, if you can show the actual data, that's a lot better than simply describing it. And the other thing is, we'll talk later about what you should bring with you when you get up in front of an audience to give a talk. I remember the first time I noticed that somebody was giving a very coherent talk, but didn't seem to have any notes. I always had notes. And I realized that their slides were their notes. The slides gave them a very good idea of what they were going to say next. Next slide. Okay, so you have a lot of ways of presenting your data, and we're going to talk a little bit about the options and what's best. Next slide. I should say that under normal circumstances, I wouldn't have to say next slide. I would advance them myself, but we discovered in the rehearsals that I was having a difficult time using the system that you use at your university for me to advance the slides. So that's why they're being advanced by Adviti. Okay, so these are the two basic ways to show data. On the left, you see tables, and on the right, you see graphs. Next slide. Okay, so let's say that I showed you this table, and you were taking notes, and you would, obviously you wouldn't be able to write down all these numbers. So what would you write down in your notes? You would probably say, as the time for this reaction increases, the amount of protein generated increases. And you might even say, looking at it quickly, it looks like it increases roughly linearly. So there's a linear relationship between reaction time and protein product. Next slide. And you would be right for the first 50 minutes. But then, if you look carefully at the data, you see that something changes. The slope of the line changes. You can't tell from this figure why it changed, but it might give you some important insight into the next research project you want to engage in. What exactly happens at 50 minutes that allows this slope to increase? So that's something that you probably wouldn't notice, and certainly your audience would almost certainly not notice if you only showed the table. Next slide. So let's talk a little bit about tables. So this is exactly the kind of slide that people show, and they say, I know this is very complicated and you won't be able to read it all and you can't take notes about it, but, and then they go on and they tell you what's important here. Well, if you think about it, what is important here? Next slide. The heading is not important. You can simply say what you're measuring. The bottom is not important. Nobody's going to be able to look at the footnotes of this slide. So what do we end up with? Next slide. We end up with this. Well, that's a lot better. A lot of stuff has been removed that would not be of any value to the audience, but still, it's a pretty complicated slide. It would take you a long time to go through all of this if it was only on one slide. So if I were showing these data, I would make it into 2 or 3 different slides. Next slide. I would just take one piece of the slide for my first slide, and I would cut out the rest. Next slide. And then I would put them together. So now we have something much simpler, and you would be able to describe this. But still, does the audience, okay, so that, go ahead. Next slide. So you see how much simpler the right side is from the left. But still, it could be made better. How can we make it better? Next slide. So now we have something very simple. Everybody will be able to see this, and it would be pretty easy to describe. It's not obvious that all of these data are important. It's not obvious that the audience needs to know what the standard error is, or even whether they need the numbers in such significant form. So I would, if I were presenting this, I would convert this to a bar graph. Now I'm going to show bar graphs, not of this data, but some other data. Next slide. Okay, next slide. All right, so let's say that, no, backwards one. Let's say that this was the very simple result that you wanted to describe. Not too much different from what I was showing you before. Okay, so you could describe this fairly easily. You could say we stressed the animals and the number of cells that that survived was reduced by about half. And then we gave a drug to see if we could block the effects of stress, and the number of cells that survived was restored to normal. However, look at this. Next slide. That really tells you all you need to know, and it tells you very quickly, visually, exactly what happened. It demonstrates that stress reduced the number of cells, but it does it in percent. You don't need to know the precise number, and that drugs block that. Now, if we were together, I would ask you, okay, how can you improve it? And here is a way to improve it. Use the whole screen. There was no reason to use only a tiny bit of the screen. And then how can we improve this? Next slide. We make the type big enough. You always want to make your type, whether it's the words or the numbers, big enough so that somebody in the back of the room can see what you're showing them. And the only way to know that for sure is to go to the back of the room. This is a little bit better. It makes more clear what the bars are. Next slide. This is even better because now you can refer, if you want, to the effects of stress shown in yellow and the effects of drug on the response to stress shown in red. Next slide. This is perhaps better still because it gives you the bottom line in words. Drug X blocked the stress-induced effects of the on cells. Now, PowerPoint, yeah, fine. PowerPoint is very powerful, and it allows you to make your bars in 3 dimensions. But what is the value of making these bars in 3 dimensions? There's no value. You're just showing off. You're showing to the audience that you can use this feature of PowerPoint. And actually, it's a little bit confusing. Next slide. It's actually not obvious when you look at these data in 3 dimensions. What is the value? Is it the orange value, which in fact it should be? Is it one of the yellow values? So I would say never use a 3-dimensional slide unless there is a 3rd dimension. There could be a 3rd dimension. You could look at these data as a function of time, but that isn't what I'm showing here. Next slide. Okay, so we're back to the simple version, but with colors. Next slide. A lot of people like to dress up their slides. So probably only maybe one of you has ever been to the University of Pittsburgh. That big, tall building is the central building of the University of Pittsburgh. It may be the tallest university building in the world. And I'm using it kind of to show off, to let you know that I'm from the University of Pittsburgh. But it doesn't have any real value. In fact, it gets in the way. So people that put all kinds of fancy things on their slides, whether it's a picture or a logo, I say take it off, get rid of it. Next slide. The only thing you might want to put on the slide is a very shorthand version of the reference, so that if somebody if you've published these data and somebody wants to look up the reference, it's there. But just a very shorthand, you don't want to put the volume in the page. People won't have time to write that down, but they could say, see Zygmunt Neuron 2016 if they wanted to follow up. Next slide. Okay, so I've been focusing on figures, but when would you want to use texts? Well, I've used them in the first two ways already. I've given you an outline of what I'm going to say. It's a kind of roadmap. If people came to hear a particular topic and it takes you a while to get there, you're at least relaxing them. You're saying, okay, I will get there. I know you're interested in this. It's just not going to come right away. I always start with acknowledgements. Some people put their acknowledgements at the end of the talk. I think that's a bad idea. If I have given a talk, when I'm finished, I want immediately to go to the slides. I don't want to put you to sleep by telling you all of the various people that contributed to this talk. If you think about going to a movie, when do people, with a movie, when do people show the acknowledgements? They show the acknowledgements when everybody is standing up, collecting everything and leaving. Hardly anybody sits in their seat to look at all the acknowledgements. So I think acknowledgements go to the beginning. Hypotheses can be stated very clearly on a text slide. Recapitulation, that is, repeating something as a form of transition, can be a slide. And then finally, a summary. And I'm going to be showing a number of summary slides in this talk. And these kinds of text slides are particularly useful for people for whom English is a second language. So if they didn't quite catch something, the text most people can read English better than they can understand it when it's spoken. So text slides can be very useful for people whose English is a second or even a third language. Next slide. Okay, so how do you make slides? Well, I am a huge fan of PowerPoint. I don't own any stock in PowerPoint, but I think PowerPoint is a great program, and it allows you to give over to PowerPoint, which has been developed over many years, many important decisions. Next slide. So PowerPoint will tell you the margins, right? PowerPoint, I have highlighted the margins. I've drawn lines around the margins. They wouldn't normally be there. But PowerPoint has, I think, a very good sense of how much space to leave for the title and how much space to leave for the text and how many lines you should have, and also even the size of the point size of the text. Next slide. Okay. So this title, and PowerPoint recommends this, is 44 point. Now you can change that, but I think it works out very nicely to have the title be very, very clear. Then the first line of text is usually 32 points, although again, you can change that. If you indent once, it goes to 28 point. If you indent again, it goes to 24 point. My own feeling is that if you go below 24 point, it's likely that there will be people in the audience, especially if it's a large room, and I've spoken to in rooms where there's as many as 1,000 people. If you go much below 24 point, there are going to be some people that won't be able to see it. It's a way of getting more information on the slide, but at a considerable cost. The cost being people won't be able to read your slide. Next slide. Okay, so this is a typical kind of slide that people show. The point size is fine. The point style, and I'll talk about different kinds of text styles is fine. But what are you going to do with this? You can't read this. It's not going to be up there long enough for you to read. So I would have to read it for you. Next slide. Never, ever use a slide as a script to be read. And the reason for that is obvious. Next slide. This is when you read to somebody. You read to somebody to put them to sleep. And that is not my objective. I think reading slides, text slides like the one I just showed you is, I would actually call it impolite. And it certainly is counterproductive because it's going to put the audience to sleep. Next slide. So this is actually exactly the same information as was in that text slide. And it would be easy for me to go through. I don't have to show all of this at once. I could show it progressively, and we'll talk about progressive disclosures in a minute. It also has the advantage that I can demonstrate the significance of the word by showing it, right? So when I want to say that you can use bold, I use bold. Italics, I use italics, et cetera, et cetera. So never have slides that need to be read. Always use outline form. Next slide. So these are the two basic classes of type. They're called, on the left, they're called sans serif, and on the right, they're called serif. Next slide. So these little hats and feet, those are called serifs. And I've never read the literature on the value of serifs, but what I've been told is that for books, it's easier to read. It's easier on the eyes to read serif type. And so if you look at your English language textbooks or any language that uses this, this alphabet, you'll see that almost always they're in serif type. But I strongly recommend that for slides, you use sans serif type. It's easy and very quick to understand. Next slide. Okay, so what should the background be for your slide? A lot of people use white background. You'll notice that I've been using a dark blue background. I really don't understand why people use white background. They seem to think it's more scientific, that I'm not trying to be fancy. But it's obvious by looking at this slide that if you are in a relatively dark room, which you often will be in a seminar, your pupils will be relatively constricted. And then when you switch from looking at me to looking at the slide, suddenly your pupils have to be dilated. And that's just, no, it's the other way around. I'm sorry. It's the other way around. Your pupils have dilated in order to get in more light in a dark room, and then they constrict in the light room. And this is fatiguing. So next slide. So this is, I believe, and of course, I'm just giving you my advice. I believe that this is a much better way to show slides. I don't even know that it's the most common way to show slides, but it's the only way I ever show slides. So I've got white on a blue background. Sometimes I want to emphasize something, as I have in the title, and in the third line, I can use yellow or orange. They're easily seen and they provide emphasis. I can make something, as I will a little bit later. I think I've already done this. I can make something gray or light blue in order to say, okay, we've talked about that. Now we're going to move on. Some people think that red is a way of providing emphasis, but I hope you will agree that the contrast between red and blue is not so great. So it may be hard to see. If you go to dark green, that's even harder to see. And some people even use gray or black, and that's very, very hard to see. So what I'm saying is yellow for titles, white for background. I'm sorry, white for text, yellow or orange if you want to show emphasis, gray or blue if you want to de-emphasize, and then I wouldn't use any other colors. Next slide. Point size, we've already talked about this. PowerPoint will give you advice about what size the size should be, what the margin should be, and what the space should be between lines. You can make things smaller. You can reduce the margins. You can have less space between lines, but all of that is at the expense of the audience being able to read what you've done. You want to always use telegraphic writing. So look at that third line. You should eliminate all the extra words, is what it says. Well, you can get rid of about half of those words, as I've shown you in the next slide. Next slide. Yeah. So all you really want to say is eliminate all extra words. Or you could even say eliminate extra words. You're not putting up slides so that you can read them. You're putting up slides as notes for you and clarifications for the audience. You want to keep your bullet points, which is what these are called, to a single line. Obviously, this helps the audience because they don't have to move their eyes from left to right and then back to left again. So a single line. And as on average, we recommend only 8 lines. That's about all you can fit in if you use the PowerPoint recommendation. Next slide. I've mentioned progressive disclosure. They can be called builds. Next slide. So you can still read the first line, but it's obvious that the second line is the more important line, the one that you want the audience to focus on. Next slide. And you can continue on like that in order to let people know what the context is, where you've been, but also make it clear where you want them to focus. Next slide. Just a quick word about videos. I won't be able to show videos, but I do sometimes, especially if I'm talking about a clinical condition, show video clips. Next slide. So this is a still of what would be a video if I was giving a talk in person. And it's just a patient who has Parkinson's disease. And as the patient moves, I can take the words on the right side and gradually present them in order to emphasize what it is that the audience is seeing. Next slide. So video clips can do things that you can't describe. It would be difficult for me to describe a patient with Parkinson's disease. Sometimes I actually bring a patient and present the patient to the audience, but that's not often available. And so I show the patient. It also breaks things up. And when I do an evaluation of my talk and I ask people what was the most memorable thing you remember, even if it's a 1-hour talk and the video is 3 minutes, they'll often say the video was the most memorable. Now, that may make me feel a little bad. It may sound like they didn't really find my talk very memorable, but it is a reality. And so I use videos in clinical talks. I will be giving a clinical talk a week from today. I virtually always use videos. Next slide. Okay, so slides can play important roles for the audience and for you. You want to keep the slides as simple as possible. Remember that you always want the people at the back of the room, and later we'll talk about the fact that you want to know how large the room is, people in the back of the room to be able to read. the only way to do that is to get someone to stand in the back of the room during a rehearsal and tell you whether they can see everything. I think figures are always better than tables. The only time you really want to use a table is if the precise number is important, and that is almost never the case in a talk. It may be important in a paper. And then you want to use PowerPoint whenever possible to help you figure out what the point size is, what the margin should be, and so forth. Next slide. I think I've sort of said all of this, so I think we can move on. Next slide. And here is our host. And this is the time for people to ask questions. I guess you put them in the chat form. And is it chat or Q&A that you use?
Yes, so I will go through some of these questions that are pasted on the PowerPoint.
Okay.
Now.
Okay, so the first question, I guess, is what is the recommendation on how much time you spend? Well, that's a very important question. Of course, it depends on the complexity of the slide. So I can tell you that I have shown about 60 slides in 45 minutes. That's probably a lot more than I would show if this was a science talk, right? So there wasn't anything that I said that was very complicated, number one. And number two, you didn't have to take notes you didn't have to make lists of things that I had on my slides because you had the lists in your handout. I would say, we'll talk a little bit later about how quickly you should speak. But I would say probably on average, if it's a data slide, 1 or 2 minutes. If you have to go through the slide and show what's the x-axis, what's the y-axis, what's the control, what the experimental, that could take a couple of minutes. If it's just a slide like this, that could take 30 seconds. Next slide.
Okay.
Other questions? How many graphs or figures? Okay, I would say almost everybody, and I didn't show you one of these, it didn't occur to me. Almost everybody puts too much on their slides. I've seen people have 4 figures on a single slide. Well, I think that's stupid. You're not going to go through all of this. That's number one. All of the figures, you're not going to explain them all. They're going to be too small. People won't be able to see them. I virtually never have more than a single graph or figure on a slide at one time. Okay. All right, so if you have a lot to show, should you summarize where you're headed and then go into details? I think it depends. You've probably seen that I had a number of summary slides at the beginning in the form of an outline and then at the end. So I think it doesn't hurt to have people know where you're going so that if they have a particular topic that they want to be sure you cover, you're assuring them that you will get to it. Okay, so I think I just dealt with this question. How can we make time management? Yeah, okay, so it's a good question. I knew how much time I had, and I knew how many slides I had, and I made a little chart. Here's my chart. You won't be able to read it, but it says essentially what topic I should be covering every 10 minutes. And so what I have down is that I should be finished by, for the first half of this after 45 minutes, and there should be a slide that says Q&A. And then actually I was only 2 minutes off. So that was pretty good. you do not want to use more time than you're given. There are lots of reasons for that. People have other things they have to do. If you're teaching students, they may have to walk across campus to get to another lecture. There may be other people that are going to use the room. I remember once hearing somebody give a talk that was a job talk, and she was still talking after the end of the hour that was given, which meant two things. First of all, there was no time for questions. And secondly, there were people trying to get into the room because the room was scheduled for somebody else, and the door kept opening and closing. And she finally said to the host, "Would you tell people that I need another 5 minutes?" Well, that was really bad form. And I don't need to tell you that she didn't get the job. So you need something like I had, and you can always, and if you noticed I did this, you can always skip a slide if you're falling a little bit behind. It's better to skip a slide than to start talking so fast that people can't follow you. Next slide. Next question. What would be your second choice? Well, it should be a darkish color. I guess I've never used anything other than blue, although of course there are lots of shades of blue. I don't know. I guess light gray would be okay, but blue is all I've used, and blue is what you see here. Now notice this slide, the blue is not even. I would always use an even background. Next slide. I think the next slide said, should you have a thank you? I never have a thank you. I don't understand it. You can say thank you very much, but to have a slide that says thank you, I mean, it's kind of like having a slide that says the acknowledgements. I don't want to spend time thanking you. I can say thank you, and I probably will say thank you at the end. Thank you very much for listening. But I would say thank you very much for listening. I would be happy to entertain questions. You want to move directly to the questions without any significant break.
Those were most of the questions that we had for now, Dr. Zygmunt. If you'd like to continue with the rest of your talk, maybe we will have more time for questions at the end.
That's fine. I'm ready.
Okay, I will just...
I don't know if people need a break, but I'm ready.
Okay, let's just continue so we have more time for extra questions at the end.
Fine.
Great.
Okay, so I suppose if normally what I would have here is another outline of all of the topics, and I would show you where I was in the outline. I didn't do that this time. But what this is telling you is that much of the rest of my presentation will be on these different kinds of talks. They're each different. If you're talking to your scientific peers, which as you become more and more senior is most of what you'll do, that's one kind of talk. Talking to a general audience, which I strongly encourage you to find opportunities for, that's a second kind of talk. As I mentioned early on, the money that we use to do our research is almost always public money, and we need the public to understand why that investment is useful. So educating them is important. A third kind of talk is when you're being considered for a job. That's a very different talk. And you might ask yourself, and we'll talk about it, why is it different? Why can't you just simply give a scientific talk to a person, a community that's considering you for a job? Another kind of talk is just an informal talk. Sometimes we call it the elevator talk. You're in an elevator, you're going up many floors, and someone turns to you and says, my name is Michael Zygmunt. I study Parkinson's disease. What do you do? Well, you only have maybe 30 seconds or at most a minute to answer that question. Of course, if you go to a scientific meeting, you have a lot more. But again, it's an informal presentation. You almost never have slides, and you need to be able to get your message across quickly, and you need to adjust the amount of time to the situation. And finally, and this is extremely important, and it's very different from a talk where you're standing up and showing slides, it's going to a scientific meeting and presenting your data as a poster. Next slide. Okay, so we're going to start with this. And here's just, I'm showing you a technique in a sense. I have an outline and I'm telling you where I am in the outline by drawing a circle around it. Okay, so I'm going to talk about the, I'm going to talk about the organization of a research seminar. Next slide. Okay, so you have 100% time, and I'm saying you want to spend about 15% of that 100%. So let's pretend for easiness that you have an hour. You won't almost ever have an hour. You'll have more like 45 minutes, but let's say an hour. So you'd spend the first 15 minutes of your time on the introduction, and the introduction would include acknowledgements, which, as you remember, I've always I recommend that you put at the beginning. Of course, a title slide, acknowledgements, an opening. Thank you very much for being here. If the host hasn't said who you are, you can say, my name's Michael Zygmunt. I'm from the University of Pittsburgh. And then you give people an overview, plus or minus a slide saying, today what I'm going to talk about is XYZ. And then you could have an objective. I hope that by the end of this presentation, you will have a clearer idea of how to make slides, how to give a talk, and how to answer questions. So that would be about 15 minutes. Then you're going to spend the great bulk of your time on your research. I always tell people, you should be talking about your research within 5 minutes. That's what they came for. They didn't come for entertainment. In general, if this is a research talk, they came to learn about your talk. Okay, so what's the question you're going to try to answer? What's your hypothesis? And remember about hypotheses. Your objective is never to prove a hypothesis. That is a very dangerous concept. Your objective is to test your hypothesis. And you may end up determining that your hypothesis was correct or incorrect. But if you suggest that you went into your research to prove something, the audience would be, I hope, suspicious about whether you were as rigorous as you could be in designing your experiments. Then very briefly, because this is a talk, it's not a paper, tell people what you did. You can say, I use a phosphate buffer. You don't want to say the pH. You don't want to say where it came from. You don't need to say how much. That would all be in your paper, but give them a general idea, then tell them the result, and that would be probably most of the time. And we talked a lot about tables versus figures. Then you want to briefly summarize what you've just showed them. And then if it's more than a 5-minute talk, you will probably have more than one set of experiments. So you want to make a transition. First, we observed this, and then we wondered what would happen if we did this. Okay, so we looked at the effects of a drug, and we saw the effects, and you saw them when I showed them to you as a slide under results. But then we wondered, well, what would happen if we use a different drug or a different dose of a drug? And so that takes you back to the question, the second set of questions. And in a typical seminar, last about 45 minutes, you might have 2 or 3 of those. Not so many, maybe 4, but not too many, or you'll make people dizzy. Next slide. Then you want to have a closing. In the closing, which is about 15% of the time, you want to provide an overall summary. You've provided summaries along the way, but the overall summary, then what are the implications? What does this mean? Why is it worth the time of the audience to hear about this? And then where might one go next? Often that's where are you going to go? And now we're going to look at the effects of this drug treatment in adult animals, having looked at young animals, or we're going to look at female animals, having looked at male animals, whatever. And if it's not something that you can do, you can say, I think an important next direction is, and describe it to the audience. You're giving them actually some advice about what, if they're interested in what you're doing, what might they do? Next slide. Always remember to leave time for questions. Sometimes people speak all the way up to the end of their allotted time. I told you about the person who spoke for the full hour and there was no time for questions. If you go to a scientific meeting, sometimes there's a new speaker every 15 minutes, and it would be terrible for you to use more than 15 minutes. In fact, it would be terrible for you to use 15 minutes. You might want to use 10 minutes, leaving time for questions, which is what Adviti has set up. Spoke for 45 minutes and then 15 minutes for questions. Next slide. Okay, so that's a kind of outline of a scientific talk. How do you prepare for a scientific talk? Next slide. Well, first you need to know who the audience is. Who are these people? Are these lay people? Are they junior scientists, undergraduate students, graduate students, postdocs, very senior people? That, of course, is going to influence the level at which you speak. What do they care about? Do they care about your topic, or is your topic just kind of a passing interest? Or is there a particular aspect of what you've done that they're interested in? How about their language skills? Increasingly, in the United States, we cannot assume that English is people's second language. An increasing percentage of people in the United States have a different first language. The most common first language is Spanish, but the second most common first language after English is Chinese. We've certainly had these professional development workshops where there were a lot of people that were in Arabic, that had Arabic as their main language. And I would say our experience is that people from Arabic language speaking countries often come to the same workshop 2 or 3 times because they've decided it's important and they need that extra exposure in order to fully understand what's being said. And then what's the size? It's a very different experience to talk to 12 people sitting either around a table or in a little circle in front of you, excuse me, and 1,000 people. I've spoken to 1,000 people. I've spoken to 1,000 people where there are several video cameras through the room so that although the people in the very back can't actually see me and may not be able to see my slides, they are looking at the video camera. Next slide. Okay, you want to know who the host is. This is very important because that's the person you will communicate with. You want to know exactly what time you're supposed to start. You want to know how long you're going to speak, obviously. Of course, you want to know where you're going to speak. I have this recurrent dream that I'm supposed to give a talk at a particular time and I can't find the room. Obviously, this has never actually happened to me, but obviously it's a fear I have. I don't know why. You want to know what the room setup is going to be like. Is there going to be a light? Is there going to be a podium? Is there going to be a microphone? Will you be able to advance the slides, or will somebody else advance the slides? And are you the only person speaking in this 1 hour time slot, or are there others? My colleague, Beth Fisher, who I mentioned at the beginning, she traveled more than 1,000 miles to be part of a symposium. There were 3 people speaking. They had a total of 1 hour to speak. So because she's very experienced, she sat down with the other 2 people and she said, okay, guys, we have 1 hour, 3 people. That means each person has 20 minutes, roughly 15 minutes to talk, and 5 minutes for questions. Everybody said, fine. So the first person got up and spoke for 30 minutes. The second person got up and spoke for 30 minutes. Beth got up, and as she got up, everybody in the room started to leave because there was another event that they were ready for, and new people started to come in. So she traveled 1,000 miles. She spent probably 3 days going, being there, and leaving, and she didn't get a chance to speak. Needless to say, she was more than a little disappointed. So you need to know what the schedule is in every respect. Next slide. Before you start speaking, you want to have identified what is it. Remember, I said 3 days later, people will only remember a certain percentage of your talk. So what are your, what we call take-home messages? If you're going to have a full talk of 45 minutes, maybe you have 2 or 3 points that you want them to remember, so that 3 days or 3 weeks from now, there'll be a few things that they'll remember. Obviously, they're not going to remember everything. If it's a short talk, which is often the case in a scientific meeting, you've got a total of 15 minutes, 10 minutes to speak and 5 minutes for questions. You'll probably only have one take-home message. Next slide. You want to organize your talk in writing, which means having a full outline. Next slide. You want to have notes so that you can have them in front of you and know what it is you're going to say. You could have everything written out. You could have your outline. You could have a printout of your slides. Don't depend on memory unless you're very polished. When you stand up in front of a group, things disappear from your brain. So don't depend on memory. Next slide. The next thing to do is make your visual aids, and we've talked a lot about them. Next slide. You want to rehearse. The first thing you want to do is to rehearse by yourself. If you've never given this talk before, you don't want to ask somebody to listen to your raw talk. Rehearse by yourself. Then I recommend that you rehearse with a video camera, because you'll notice things when you look at yourself giving the talk that you wouldn't have realized. You might notice that you're always looking at the slides, or you're always looking down, or you're always looking very serious, or you're not moving your arms at all, or you're moving your arms so much that it looks like you're trying to fly. And then try to get together some colleagues, maybe some fellow postdocs at your institution, and bring them together and ask them to listen to you and to give you feedback. And basically, on the basis of that feedback, you go back to your talk and you revise it. You figure out some things that are not necessary and some things that you should have said that are necessary. And by the way, people can point out to you, as I pointed out to you for myself, some typographical errors on the slides. Next slide. It's very important to prepare for questions. Some people think, well, that's not fair. You're supposed to be so ready to respond to the audience that that you just don't think about the questions. But that's a mistake. You can probably anticipate most of the questions that people will ask. especially if you've given this talk more than once. And so you should anticipate those questions, and you should plan your answers, and you should practice your answers just like you practice the answers for you practice your talk. Next slide. Okay, let's talk a little bit about delivering your talk. So what should you look at? There are lots of things that you can look at when you're up there in front of a group. Next slide. You could look at the floor. A lot of people do that. They look at the floor because they're so nervous. They don't want to look at the audience. They think maybe the audience will be frowning or doing something. Or the other thing that people do is they look at the ceiling, again, trying to avoid the audience. Many people spend their whole time with their back to the audience looking at the screen, because the screen is their notes, as I mentioned. But you don't want to look at the screen. You don't want to look out at infinity. And you don't want to look at the one person in the front row who seems to be smiling and nodding their head. You want, next slide. You want to look at everybody. Obviously, if it's an audience of more than a few people, you can't look at everybody at the same time. But you scan the whole audience. You're being polite. You're making it clear that you care about everybody. So you want to scan the whole audience slowly. Don't keep jerking your head back and forth, but slowly you want to scan the audience. It's, if nothing else, it's polite. Next slide. How quickly should you speak? So this is relevant to the question of how many slides you should show. Next slide. Our advice is that you shouldn't speak more than about 10 words in every 5 seconds. Now, I don't have a stopwatch, I can't tell you, but if you notice, there are 10 words in this statement. Don't say more than 10 words in every 5 seconds. So you can time yourself, or you can have a friend say this sentence 3 or 4 times and see how long it takes you. In our experience, 10 words in 5 seconds is about the right rate. It's not so slow that people are going to get bored and annoyed, but it's not so fast that people will not be able to follow you. One of the things that some people do is they look at the clock, as I am now, and they realize, oh my goodness, I'm running out of time. And so there are 2 ways they can deal with that. One is they can skip some things, but the other thing they can do is start talking very, very fast. And of course, nobody can understand them. You don't want to do that. Next slide. Okay, someone's asked how much time should you spend on slides? I would say about 2 minutes for a data slide, especially a table, but even a figure. And if it's a text slide, usually half a minute or a minute for a slide. So you can calculate based on that how many slides you can show depending on the amount of time that you have for your talk. Next slide. Okay, what tools do you need in order to give your talk? Next slide. Okay, I've already said that your script is not something you want. You might want to write out your whole talk as you're preparing, especially if English is not your first language, but you don't want that up in front of your in front of you while you're giving your talk. I mean, imagine you lose your place. How are you going to know where to be? So you don't want your script. Next slide. You want notes. I have notes. Sometimes I print out my slides, so the handout like you have. Sometimes you want to actually write out the first paragraph and the last paragraph of your talk. The reason for that is that if you're not experienced in giving talks, you stand up there, suddenly your mouth is dry, you can't remember what it is you wanted to say. It's okay to have your first paragraph written out. Hopefully, usually, by the time you're finished the first paragraph, things have loosened up. Also, the moderator says, Dr. Zygmunt, you only have 2 minutes left, and you get confused, nervous. You could, in principle, have the last paragraph written out as well. You might want to have experimental details. If someone raises their hand and says, what kind of buffer did you use, or at what speed do you centrifuge, you wouldn't probably put that in your slides, but you can have the data there either to answer or to say, why don't we get together after this talk and I'll give you that information. You always want your presentation in some form. At the very least, you want it on your computer, but I've had a number of experiences in which I went to a different location, sometimes a different country, excuse me, and my computer was not compatible with their projector. So I always have with me, and in fact, I have it now, this a little flash drive, and I have my talk on the flash drive. Of course, in this case, it's not necessary because I sent my slides ahead of time. You want to be sure that there's a projection device. Occasionally, I've spoken to a very small group that didn't have a projection device, but I have a very small projector. I can actually put it in a backpack. Sometimes you want to demonstrate something, as I just did for a flash drive. There are any number of things that you might want to demonstrate. You might want to bring it and show it. Generally speaking, you want a podium, something that you can stand behind. You want a podium light, and we'll talk about this in a minute. The light is on you. There's an advantage to being able to control the lights yourself. The slides yourself, that didn't turn out to be possible here, which is why I have to keep saying next, which is fine. It's working, but it's better to be able to show the slides so that you know when to move forward and when, in some cases, you want to go backwards. It's nice if you can control the lights. That's often not possible, but it's useful so that you can dim the lights and at the end make the lights come on again. But if you can't do that, you want to talk to the host so that it's clear. You want to have, usually you want to have cough drops in case your voice starts to get harsh. You want to have some way of knowing what time it is. I have a big clock right in front of me, so I can already tell that I'm falling behind. And you want to have a cup of water. Next slide. So here's a picture of someone you may recognize. He came up to the podium not with a cup of water, but with a bottle of water. When I see somebody speaking with a bottle of water, I think of a baby speaking from a baby bottle. So I have, and you probably won't be able to see this, but I have this cup here, or a glass, and at any point I can simply quickly drink it, put it back. So I recommend that you take, I have a collapsible cup, bring along with you a collapsible cup in case the host doesn't have a cup, and just fill it with water before you get started. Next slide. Okay, so what's the problem here? This is a nice bright room. You can see me, you can be able to take notes, but it's hard to see the slide because the light in the room is blanching out the slide. Next slide. Here's the opposite. You can see the slide very nicely, but you can't see me. You can't take notes. Next slide. And this may happen. That's not what you want to happen. Next slide. So one suggestion, if it's available, and again, this is part of why you want to check the audience, is have the room be relatively dark so that the slides can easily be seen, but have a light on you. It could be a light from above, or it could be a light on the podium. So that way you can be seen and the slide can be seen. Next slide. Why is it valuable for you to be seen? because there are a lot of nonverbal cues that are useful to be able to provide. Next slide. So obviously, you want to modulate your voice. You can decide whether to be quiet. Interestingly, if you're quiet just for a little bit, people will strain to hear you, and that can actually be just as good in getting people's attention as if you speak very loudly. You don't want to speak loudly for a long time. So being able to modulate your voice, inflection, showing emphasis, this is really important, that kind of thing. But it's also useful to be able to use your hands, not too much, but a little bit. I don't exactly know what this means. You can't see me, but why do people do this? Or why do people do that? I don't know exactly, but it's conveying information. You don't want to use too much. You don't want to be looking like this. As I said, that's like you're flying. You'll make people dizzy. Facial expressions. It's nice to smile at your audience. I probably haven't been smiling very much, but smiling is good. And where should you stand? You should stand facing the audience so that you can glance over to the slides, or maybe sometimes there's a monitor in front of you so you can see the slides, but you don't want your back to the audience. Next slide. Answering questions. Now, this may be obvious, and I've already told you that you want to practice answering the questions, but there's an art to answering questions. First of all, when you finish with your talk and it's time to ask questions, don't suddenly say to yourself, oh, finally it's over. I'm glad it's over, and you lose any kind of enthusiasm. You want to remain alert. You want to be welcoming. You want to say something, unless the host says something. You want to say, okay, I'd be very interested in hearing your questions. By the way, you can say, if you want, I'd be glad to answer questions while I'm talking, so feel free to interrupt me. I recommend not doing that until you're very experienced, because if someone interrupts you and asks a question, you may kind of lose your place. So the way it's being done today is probably the best. Wait for the questions until the end. When someone asks a question, you want to be very polite. You want to look at the person that's asking the question. You don't want to stare out into space. This is not the time to scan the audience. You can tell I haven't remembered to bring a cough drop. So you want to look at the audience. You want to make it clear that you're interested, even if you're not, even if you think it's a stupid question, even if you think you've already answered that question. You want to show your interest. Next slide. Then you want to restate the question. Why do you want to restate the question? Well, because not everybody may have heard the question. That's one reason. Another reason is that you might want to modify the question. You might want to make it more general, so that if somebody says, I don't know, I can't think of a good example right now, but if someone asks for something very specific, you may want to make it more general. Then when you answer the question, you want to answer the question for the whole audience. You're not simply talking to the one person that asked the question. You want to, having repeated the question for everybody, you want to respond to everybody with the question, with the answer. You want to be very brief. It probably shouldn't take more than about 30 seconds to answer any question. Every once in a while, someone will ask you a question and you don't know the answer. That's the time to say, I don't know the answer. Thank you very much, but I don't know the answer. I've never thought about that, or I just simply don't know. Don't pretend you know an answer, because the next thing is someone's going to say, oh, that's really interesting. Could you give me the reference to that? Of course, you don't know the reference because you sort of made it up, or you made a wild guess. So admit ignorance. If someone asks you something very specific, like, could you tell me the exact makeup of the buffer? Or where exactly did you get your mice and what's the strain of the mice? This is information that almost certainly is more specific than most people in the audience will want. So you could say, let's talk about that later. Or if that's not an option, hopefully you've had your email address at on the first slide, and you could add it on the last slide, and you could say, please send me an email and be glad to talk to you about it. Next slide. Okay, so if you're a non-native speaker, what are the special suggestions? Next slide. The most important thing is to try to find a native speaker. There's usually going to be a native speaker somewhere in your community, and ask them to listen to you so that if you're mispronouncing something, they will be able to tell you. Use text slides, as I've already indicated. Start speaking slowly, because virtually everybody has a different accent. Even within the United States, there are many, many regional accents, and people need to get used to your accent. So give them a few minutes. I've already said focus on pronunciation, not on grammar. I can correct your grammar if I can understand what you say. And English, I don't really know anything about Arabic, to tell you the truth, but in English, almost all words have alternatives. There's different ways of saying almost any word. And if you are not a native English speaker, don't stumble on complicated words that you're going to have a hard time pronouncing. Just use a word that's easy to pronounce. Next slide. Okay, so I've talked about each of these things. I didn't talk about the last point, which is nonverbal speech. I don't know about Arabic, but in English, when people give talks in English, there are all these filler words like, I mean, and I think that those are words that people throw in because they think they should keep talking even though they don't know what the next word is. And you want to get rid of those. One of the advantages of videotaping your talk is that you probably are not aware of the nonverbal words until you watch yourself, and then you realize it. One of the filler words that my grandchildren use is like. So they can hardly say a sentence without using the word like. And it drives me crazy, but I don't seem to be able to do anything about it. They can't speak a single sentence without saying like. I don't know where that comes from. I think it shows a lack of sophistication, but I have been unsuccessful, even for the grandchild who's 20 years old and in her third year of college. I've been unsuccessful in getting her to stop saying like. Next slide. Okay, these are four other mistakes that people make answering the question or giving the talk to a particular person, maybe somebody that seems really enthusiastic, not the whole audience. I remember somebody giving a talk about it was her PhD defense, and there was somebody in the front of the room crying and scowling, and she looked at that person and assumed that her talk must be terrible. What she didn't realize is that person had just gotten a letter saying their grant application had been rejected. It had nothing to do with her. So scan the whole audience. Don't talk too fast. Be sure that you practice. There's nothing special about being able to outline and talk and then immediately stand up and give it. A talk is almost always worth giving as well as possible. And don't be too stiff. Be as relaxed as you can be, despite the fact that you may be very nervous. Next slide. Okay, I've really said all this already. That's why it's called a summary. You want to give your talk in words and in slides, but you don't want to read the slide. That is a very bad and I would argue impolite thing to do. Next slide. Okay, so I have focused on scientific talks. I'm just going to say a very few words about general audiences and job talks. Next slide. So talking to a general audience can be very important. I've emphasized that. I think it's a way of building interest in science. And here in the United States, we've got a serious problem with convincing people that they should pay attention to science. I won't go into details, but you can imagine, for example, wearing masks, social distance, not touching your face. This is Some people seem to think that none of this is true. And it's one of the reasons that the United States has the largest number of COVID-19 cases of any country in the world. It's really quite amazing. You want to make things simple, not too simple, but simple enough so that the people in the audience can understand. And you want to explain why what you're saying is relevant to them. Next slide. So what if you're giving a job talk? In what way is a job talk different from a scientific talk to peers? Now, if we were together, I would ask you to answer that question, but we can't do that. So what the people in the audience for a job talk want to know? They want to know what you know, right? There may be a committee that has selected you as a possible job candidate and is going to interview you one-on-one. But at the end of the day, the decision about whether to hire you is going to be made probably by the entire department. So this is very important. You want to make a good impression on everybody that comes. It's the one chance you have to talk to almost all the people in the department. So they want to know, what do you know? They want to know, what kind of research do you do? They may want to know whether you can teach, because in most universities in the United States, faculty members do both research and teach. So they may want to know, well, what would you be like in front of a class? They want to know what you can do for their department. Most departments will, if they're lucky, be able to add one person on any given year. So these appointments are very valuable. What will you do for the department? Not just one person and not for the entire school, but the department. Will you bring in some method that other people don't know? Will you be a person that they can collaborate with and maybe expand their reach? And then what kind of a person are you? Are you somebody that I would enjoy? Do you seem like a nice, friendly, open person? Or will I avoid you because I don't think that I would enjoy interacting with you? Next slide. Informal discussion, it's probably pretty obvious. Next slide. You you'll have anywhere from 30 seconds to 5 minutes. So you want to keep it short. You don't want to direct the discussion. You don't know what's interesting to them. So I could say, hi, I'm Michael Zygmunt. I'm from the University of Pittsburgh and I study Parkinson's disease. Well, they may care about Pittsburgh. Oh, Pittsburgh, I have an uncle in Pittsburgh. Tell me about it. Or they may care about Parkinson's disease. Or they may say, well, do you know anything about Alzheimer's disease? So let them direct the questions, the conversation, and make it clear that you're interested in talking to them. It's not just that you happen to be thrown in front of them. I still remember I was going to a meeting of the Society for Neuroscience I was sitting on a bus coming from the hotel to the conference, and I turned to the person next to me. I almost always introduce myself. They may not care, or they may care, and I say, "Hi, I'm Michael Zygmunt. I study Parkinson's disease." And the person that I was talking to said, "Oh, my name is Arvid Carlson. I also study Parkinson's disease." Well, 10 years later, he got the Nobel Prize for the work that he did. And in that interim of 10 years, we became good friends. He visited me at the University of Pittsburgh. I visited him in Sweden, and it was a very valuable interaction. Next slide. Poster presentation. Now, I'm not sure that I will have enough time to talk about this, but we'll see. So poster presentations can be very, very valuable. And but there's an art to putting together a good poster. So here's just a sort of template. This is kind of like what a poster would be. There's a big title so people can see it from a distance. On the left side, there'll be an introduction and methods, usually very short. In the middle, there'll be results, usually almost always figures, bar graphs or line graphs. On the right side, there's a summary. There's the conclusions, and then usually in fairly small type, there's acknowledgements, and sometimes there's references. Now, notice the organization. It's from left to right. The reason is that if you're at a big meeting, there may be, and I'll show you a picture of this in a few minutes, there may be 25 people standing, there you go, 25 people. Look at that. This slide in the bottom left is, and bottom right is one of my slides. And the woman in wearing black clothes, she's was my postdoc. So people are going to have a hard time looking at this poster. They'll gradually get in front of the poster, but they're not going to be able to go left to right, left to right, left to right. If they're lucky, we'll be able to move from left to right. So they need the material on the poster to be organized left to right. They can't look at the first top figure, then look at the next one in the middle, then come back to the second one on the left. Things have to be in the order in which they can move. Next slide. Okay, so these are all I'll go back to that point in a minute. These are all the things you want to know. When is the poster to be put up? And by the way, when should you put the poster up? Usually you would put the poster up about 15 minutes before the presentation, but not much more than that, because maybe there's already somebody else's poster there. How much space will you have? You need to ask the organizer, what's the board? What's the size of the board? What will be provided? Will they be providing tacks, thumbtacks, so you can put it up, or are you supposed to bring the slides, the poster? How long will it be on display? Sometimes in small meetings, the poster will be up for several days, which means you're not going to be with it all the time. That's a very different kind of poster than if it's only going to be up for 3 or 4 hours and you'll be there to answer questions. So in one case, it has to be self-contained. You won't be there to answer questions. In the other case, you'll be there. Next slide. Okay, so posters are different from papers. I have actually gone to meetings and I've seen someone taking let's say a 10-page paper, and they just thumbtacked the paper on the poster board. I wish I'd thought to take a picture of that. That's of course ridiculous. No one's going to spend, if you're lucky, someone's going to spend as much as 10 minutes, probably not that much time. If you go to a meeting like the Society for Neuroscience, there could be more than 1,000 posters up at the same time. So you're lucky if you get somebody for 5 minutes. Usually there's no peer review. And so you and your colleagues who you will get feedback from are the only people who will be able to adjust it. If at all possible, you want to be there to guide people. If someone looks interested in your talk, in your poster, it's perfectly reasonable to go up to them and say, "Can I walk you through the poster?" Sometimes they'll say, "No, I'm fine. If I have any questions, I'll come to you." But more often than not, they'll say, "Yes, please do." And that's the best thing, because you can be there. You can make a very brief presentation. You can be there to answer questions. The method sections are usually very brief, because no one's going to be able to assimilate everything you will have done. And this is a great way to exchange ideas one-on-one, much better than in a oral presentation. So I always encourage my students to give poster presentations if possible. Next slide. Okay, the organization is essentially the same as the organization of a talk. Next slide. This is what I was saying before. This is the organization of the poster, because people are going to move from left to right. Next slide. Again, I encourage you to use sans serif, the one without the little feet and heads, the point size is roughly the same as the point size that I indicated for a slide. Next slide. I think the only thing that I need to emphasize here is that I would encourage you to bring a business card. Some of you don't have business cards. Maybe you're only graduate students or postdocs. You might think that you're not senior enough to have a business card. I would recommend having business cards made, so that if there's a conversation that you want to continue, you can just simply reach into your pocket, give them a business card, and say, let's continue to talk. I would say try to be with your poster as much as possible, and take a notebook so that you can take notes of the important points. And how you dress really depends on the kind of meeting. I've seen people dress in a suit and tie, a man, at a very informal meeting where everybody's wearing short sleeve shirts and shorts. So that it looks pretty silly. On the other hand, I've seen people wear short sleeve shirts and shorts at a very senior, very formal meeting. So you want to get a sense of how people dress for this kind of meeting. Next slide. I think the bottom line is that being able to give a good presentation, whether it's a stand-up presentation, a poster, an informal presentation, is a very important skill. Here's just an example of of an advertisement that might indicate that one of the critical criteria for being hired is good communication skills. Next slide. It's time consuming, especially if you haven't done this. So of course, I've given this talk probably 50 times or more. So I didn't need to spend too much time, but I did spend time simplifying things, getting it appropriate and fitting into the right time slot. For some people, giving a talk is very difficult, especially at the beginning. It can make you very nervous. Being a little bit nervous is a good thing. If you're too relaxed, you may not give as good a talk. you should always be a little bit nervous. But if you practice, you will be rewarded. You'll be rewarded by a sense of satisfaction, by your reputation, and perhaps by a job. So thank you very much. And we have time. In fact, I've ended at just the right time. We have time for as many questions as you want. And I just remind you of my email address. And if you didn't write it down, Adviti can give it to you. I'd be glad to continue the discussion.
Thank you, Dr. Zsigmond, for the really great recommendations. I'd just like to remind the audience to continue posting their questions on the Q&A tab and not the chat tab, and please direct them to all the panelists so I can view them and post them on the slide. Okay, so here is your first question, Dr. Zsigmond.
Yeah, I think the only way to overcome your fear is to jump in there and do it, and do it often. First, with an audience of friends, so that that you're not too nervous, and then gradually increase the intensity of the situation. So if the first talk I had ever given had been to 1,000 people, I probably wouldn't have made it through. When I was a postdoc, I indicated that there was no official opportunity to give talks. So I got together with 5 or 6 other postdocs in the same department, and we met once a week and we practiced giving each other talks. Even then, when I gave my first job talk, I'm sure I didn't do a very good job. I didn't get that job offer. I think it's just practice, but I think you never want to be totally relaxed. There always needs to be a little bit of tension. I think you'll do a better job if there's a little bit of stress, but not so much that it disrupts you. Next slide. Next question. Yeah, I don't know. No one's ever asked me that question. I have not had the sense that it has changed. There is one thing that people typically do that I didn't mention. In addition to a formal presentation in which the entire university is invited and most of the people in the department are there, there's often something called a Blackboard talk. That is, after the formal talk, maybe the next day, the department, just the people that are in the department, or sometimes even just the people on the search committee, will go into a small room. You won't have any slides. You'll have a blackboard and a piece of chalk, and you'll be there primarily to answer questions. So that can get more intense. They can drill down on very specific things. But actually, that was true when I got my first job at the University of Pittsburgh. There was a Blackboard talk. So I don't know. I would be interested if any of the people part of the audience have a sense that there's a change, but I don't think. Okay, so I guess the issue that's being addressed in this question is, do you ever get a job just by people looking at your CV and not listening to you? I don't think so. Not in academia. I think people always want to listen to you, be able to answer questions, get a sense if you seem to be the kind of personality that they would enjoy interacting with. So no, I do not have the sense that it's changed.
Okay, maybe I'll read out the question for as well so that the audience can hear in case
Oh,
they're
sure.
not
I'm sorry.
watching.
I'm sorry.
That's all right. At the time of this pandemic, most presentations have now been moved online. Any recommendations to improvise when you can't see or gauge your audience?
You know, I never thought about that question, and I have no experience at all with that. I can't imagine that anybody is going to be ever hired without at least a webinar or Zoom kind of, or even just a FaceTime presentation. I think there's always going to be the equivalent of face-to-face, even if you're not actually in the same room. And I'm sure that must be going on now, um, uh, in terms of being interviewed for college, for graduate school, for postdoc, for a job. But I don't actually know that. I do have a friend who's applying to a music school, and of course, to apply to the music school, to be interviewed, you have to play your instrument. Um, and she's basically just sitting out a year because she can't show up and and actually play her instrument. I suppose if it's a small instrument, she could in theory, but of course the sound quality would be poor. If you're a pianist, it's not obvious how you could do that. So yeah, I would say if it's an academic talk, you probably can do it by Zoom. And everything I've said, almost everything I've said in terms of rehearsal and quality of slides and everything would stand. But you're right that you can't see the audience. So you're at a disadvantage. That's a very good question that I never thought about that. The next time I give a talk, I will add that.
Okay, so the next one is how can I be succinct but still give enough detail in a presentation to a lay audience?
I guess that's a judgment call. I think if you imagine yourself as someone in a lay audience, and by the way, you have been in a lay audience with respect to some topics, right? Um, you know, you have specialties, but you might be interested in something else. For example, I'm here in Woods Hole, Massachusetts. This is a scientific center. There are probably 5 different research centers here within 2 miles of where I live. It's part of why I'm here, and there is one of the scientific centers is called the Marine Biological Laboratory, and they have in the summer they have a talk every Friday night, and so I have listened to talks on things like uh, COVID-19 and the pandemic and global warming. I've listened to talks on birdsong. I've listened to talks on horseshoe crabs. None of these are. I mean, I'm a lay person for all of these, but the person who was speaking was in every case, of course, they were selected because they were very experienced. They did, I think, a very good job of giving me as much as I needed to know, but not more, but also sending me of course, I knew their names, so I could look up their papers and providing the email address if I wanted to contact them. So I think it's an art. I think it's a very good question, but you know how much time you have, just like I knew how much time I had, and you kind of lay it out, and you realize, as I did, that there's no way that I was going to show 250 slides in two 45-minute amounts of time. So I started to cut down and put some details on slides that I didn't have on slides. I think it's an important question, but I think as long as you know how much time you have, you can kind of trim your talk so that it fits the time.
Okay, see the next one. At a job interview presentation, how much detail do you go into the different projects that you were involved in? I guess, again, this is a matter of time.
Yeah. So let me start by saying that's a very good question. And then I want to say, you should never say that's a very good question, because the implication is that when you didn't say it was a very good question, it must not be a good question. So always treat every question as a good question. But it is a very good question because people want to know what you can bring to them. Your job is not to provide a summary of all the things you're involved in. So, for example, there are certain methods that I have available to me, I had available to me in my lab. And sometimes someone would come to me and say, you know, we're doing XYZ, and would you be willing to take the tissue and assay it for us? And of course, I always said yes, but that's not, I might want to indicate some of the methods that would be available to in my lab if you hired me, so that people would know that I would add some skills to the community. But what they really want to know is, what did I do? And you only have a certain amount of time, usually 45 minutes. So you might want to just refer very briefly to some of the things you collaborated on, but you want to focus down on the things that are the primary things that you did, and only the number of things that you have time to talk about, and also the things that you have some reason to believe they'll be interested in. I helped somebody give a job talk, or at least let's say I tried. Some people you can't help. I tried to help somebody organize a job talk, and he had too many slides. He had maybe 4 or 5 things on every slide. He talked about everything he was involved in, whether it was something that was central to him, something that he would bring to the group. And I strongly encouraged him not to do it. He did it anyway, and he didn't get the job. So yeah, you need to figure out what is going to sell and how much you can sell in the time you have available, which is usually 45 minutes.
Okay, again, related to job interview presentations, so they sometimes seem boastful. Can one highlight all their skills without seeming arrogant?
I hesitate to say that's a good question, because I just said you shouldn't say that, but that is a good question. I can't say. I mean, of course, I've been to many, many job talks over the years. I can't say that I ever encountered somebody who seemed to be boasting. I think the more common problem is that people undersell themselves rather than seeming boastful. You're absolutely right. The person that asked that's not what you want. After all, among the things you are trying to demonstrate is that you would be a good colleague, and nobody likes arrogant people. So you want to be low key, but not so low that you don't show your enthusiasm and your willingness to interact and collaborate.
Okay. So what are the topics to cover in a job interview presentation?
This is a great audience. It's another great question. Okay, so often the way to answer a question like this, and this is what I'm going to do as I answer it, is to put yourself in the position of the interviewer in this case, or the member of the audience. Okay, so I'm interviewing you. What do I want to know? Well, I've mentioned some of them. I want to know what you know. I want to know how well you know them. I want to know whether you seem like somebody who is collaborative. I want to know whether you seem like somebody that I would be interested in interacting with, both as a scientist, but also just as a colleague. Remember, faculty meetings occur sometimes every week, and you're not always talking about science. You may be talking about, what kind of classes should be taught, what kind of seminars should be offered. So there are lots of things that come up that you want to know about. But there are, so I don't know if anyone's going to ask this question, but there's another side to this. If you are being interviewed, what do you want to know, right? And you want to know when you would start. That may be important to you. You may be in the middle of something, or you may be married to somebody that's in the middle of something. You may not be available to move tomorrow. On the other hand, if I said I wouldn't be ready to move for 2 years, they'd probably say, well, come back to us in 2 years and we'll see if we still have a position. So you want to know when they expect you, and you want to give them an idea of when you could move. It shouldn't be crazy. It probably should be within a year. Secondly, you'd like to know where your lab would be. Because if you need certain core facilities or you want to interact with particular people, you may want to be in one particular building and not another building. You may want to know how much space you'll have. I still remember when I was offered a job, nobody told me how large my lab would be. And I had to ask that. You may want to know about startup money. It's typical, at least in the United States, for you because you often will not, if it's your first job, you won't have a grant yet. It's typical that you'll be given some amount of money. In the United States, it could be $10,000, $20,000 to get you started while you're applying for your grant. You might want to know about graduate students. You certainly would want to know what your teaching responsibilities would be. If it turns out that you have to teach introductory biology, for example, in my case, I've never taken a course in introductory biology. That would be quite time consuming. I'm not saying that I wouldn't do it, but that would be part of my calculation because hopefully in the end I'll have 2 or 3 offers and I'll decide which one. I'd like to know something about the environment, the city, the opportunities, but that probably isn't something I'd ask the search committee for. So I think it goes both ways, right? And you want it to go both ways, and the search committee wants it to go both ways. They don't want you to be so anxious for a job that you'll take any job. You want to make it clear that you've got some requirements too, but you don't want to be too heavy-handed about that.
Great. Thank you, Dr. Zygmunt. So in the interest of time, I think let's move on. I know it's been a long webinar, and you've done really a great job at giving us all of that great advice, sticking to time and lasting for the 2 hours. So thank you very much, Dr. Zygmunt. We're really honored that you could share your time and your expertise with us today. We really appreciate it.
I hope that a day will come when I will be able to be in front of you in real time in Qatar. I've never been to Qatar, but I've read a little bit about it. It seems like a great place. In the meantime, you probably have my email address. Aditi can also help you contact me, and I'm available to continue the discussions. And I really appreciate all the time you devoted to me.
Thank you so much. We really hope we can host you again in the future. So I'd like to also thank the audience for joining in today and for all your active participation in the Q&A session. We had a couple of questions on the recording for the webinar. Everyone was very keen on receiving the recording, so we'll send you a link to it in the next couple of days. And you will also be able to find it on the HBKU YouTube channel, a link to which I've again posted on the Q&A tab. We did get some recommendations for future research, for future topics. I think it included research writing, and we will definitely keep your recommendations for when we decide to host the next one. Also, once we close the webinar, a short feedback survey will pop up. It would be great if you could fill that in so we know how it went and any advice you'd like to give us for the future. Also, again, if more of you have topics of interest that you'd like us to cover in future webinars, please send us an email and we'd be glad to help out with that. Lastly, I'd also like to thank the wonderful technical team running the show behind the scenes. So Dr. Salam, who's a fellow postdoc, Mr. Omar and Ms. Reem, who are from the QBRI communications team. Thank you to you guys as well. So stay tuned in for more inspiring stories in our next webinar, which will be in October, and this will be announced shortly on the HBKU as well as QBRI website and social media. Have a great evening, everyone. Stay safe, stay well, and stay inspired. Thank you.